Radio Raheem here with the man himself, Don King, the living legend. You have put on so many legendary heavyweight boxing events.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the shocking story of Don King. Used to represent boxing. Greater-than-life promoter who dominated the sport more than anybody else. Renowned for his audacious nature, wild entrances, and extraordinary talent to transform combatants into celebrities, King became a byword for the display of the game. But over time, his empire started to go apart. Today, Don King is a long way off. Shout from the man who used to be in charge of the prominence. He is currently in his 90s and leads a very different tale, full with legal financial difficulties and a declining legacy. What become of the individual who once held boxing's destiny in his hands? And in this movie, we explore the terrible life of Don King's final years, investigating the demise of a man who constructed an empire and saw it disappear. It's a story of authority, greed, and atonement, one that serves as a reminder in the end of how King was born with the potential for short-term fame. June 20th, 1931, Cleveland, Ohio. His formative years were difficult. Having a challenging family life and poverty, however, King's aspirations were evident from young. When he first entered, he had already experienced adulthood, fraught with controversy, including an imprisonment for manslaughter following a violent confrontation. In spite of these initial setbacks, King's determination to achieve drove him to boxing, an activity that might influence the remainder of his life. King's admission into the boxing world was anything but traditional. He began as a part-time promoter, but his life is bigger than personality, flamboyant fashion sense, and capacity to convince fighters to sign contracts swiftly. Attracted the King's most noteworthy early accomplishment occurred when he started collaborating with Muhammad Ali. Their working together produced some of the largest bouts in boxing history, such as the renowned Rumble in the Jungle. King's 1974 matchup with George Foreman was behind the scenes planning the battle that would establish Ali's position in King's star climbed along with history. Impact on the boxing community. He established Don King Productions and created a thriving business that prevailed in the sport during the 1970s and 1980s. King inked high-level boxers such as Larry Holmes and Mike Tyson, with Roberto Duran planning a few of the most famous battles of the time period. His capacity to promote battles using theatrical flair and his ability to produce, he became a household name. Royal thanks to publicity. Was more than simply a promoter now. He was a prominent boxer with the capacity to specify who engaged in combat, when, and why. How much of his most noteworthy contribution was transforming boxing into the days of show battles were over. Concerning the game, but also the drama, and King developed narratives centered around them using his bold, distinctive style, which includes his outrageous hairstyle and daring dress choices. King turned become as much of a show as he advertised to the fighters. His capacity to attract the interest of both fans and his life was magnified by the media. Figure who was crucial to the heyday of athletics. But everything started to fall apart to make an appearance during King's reign. When he was busy generating money and encouraging fights, his connections with fighters began to poison the tales of his violent business strategies, such as deceitful, unfulfilled pledges and contracts started spreading. The fighters King worked with began to voice their opinions, claiming that he took more than his equitable portion of profits, and dubious choices that adversely. These rumors affected their careers, would ultimately result in conflicts in public with combatants such as Mike Tyson, who would subsequently assert that King had stolen millions from him when they were cooperating. In spite of these problems, King remained prosperous in the realm of boxing while sowing the seeds of his future. King's downfall had already been woven into as boxing power increased. So did his associated disputes. Are among the key elements that contributed to his demise was his participation in a 1954 King's conviction for manslaughter, had been incarcerated for trampling on a man to death over a disagreement about gambling and an incident that would resurface him during his professional life. Although he spent 3 years behind bars, the tale of his history of violence persisted in the history of his public persona, including layers of intricacy to the personality of the man in charge of the empire during the king's business in the 1980s and 1990s. Practices were scrutinized more closely. He was sued by combatants who reported to have been financially exploited, with many claiming that he signed unfairly agreements. Particularly Mike Tyson's. He would be sued by the biggest star for stealing. Tyson's earnings totaled millions. King's legal battle was one of the most widely reported in the history of boxing, and it signaled the start of King's decline. Tyson's allegations caused so much harm that they damaged King's standing, which led to additional litigation and an expanding number of combatants pulling away from the promoter. King's legal troubles continued. He was also charged with tax evasion there. One more mark on his already contentious career and business procedures, such as signing combatants to exclusive agreements and collecting a large portion of their profits, alienated a lot of people he had previously collaborated with. As the cases mounted, it became evident that Don King's tenure as the most insignificant person was disappearing. Once the sports king, he was now, in an effort to preserve his riches and his standing in spite of his legal issues, Don King kept up his public image portrayal as the captivating greater-than-a-life promoter. But in the background his empire was in decline due to his financial problems worsened. King discovered growing more alone and dependent on a tiny group of facilitators who persisted and encouraged him in spite of his deteriorating situation. His capacity to sketch in the boxing world large crowds and make money from fights broke out, and he found it difficult to stay relevant in a constantly evolving in the boxing world. By the 2000s, King was no longer the dominant force he was in. He continued to encourage fights in the 1980s, but his impact has waned. Notably, the emergence of new stars such as Floyd Mayweather Jr. S. rise to prominence events at the UFC further forced King out of the focus on his financial and legal. It got more difficult to overlook hardships and his formerly glitzy status as the boxing king started to fall apart. By his Don King was not the same in the late 1980s. Energetic energy in boxing that had before decided that the health of the industry. King had decreased, and he grew more separated from the man who had previously been at the center of everything. Has been located himself as a forgotten figure in the background, character in a sport that had evolved. His deteriorating health without him, coupled with growing legal concerns and his financial difficulties, pushed him into a more sedate and private life. The man who once walked with a king's swagger now encountered the physical difficulties of aging. His formerly powerful position in the sport was supplanted by fresh individuals who had a more contemporary method of boxing promotion of up-and-coming celebrities such as Floyd Mayweather Jr., and institutions such as the UFC further undermined King's once unchallenged control over the sport. And his Don King continues to be a symbol of interest in the boxing world. However, he is no longer the tall figure he used to be, and he still does sometimes shows up in public and works occasionally with today's younger combatants. King is no longer the advocate for the global. His name carries weight in the biggest fights, just in that it's connected to the past. The formerly active individual who produced magnificent displays and amassed a fortune. Boxing is now a shadow of his former self. And his deteriorating health, coupled with growing legal concerns and his financial difficulties, have pushed him into a more solitary and silent. The legacy of the existence King is now a blend of respect and animosity for those who can recall the heyday of boxing. Is still regarded as a pivotal figure in forming the sport, but particularly for a lot of other people, combatants who believe they were taken advantage of by the legacy of the King is tarnished, and his name has come to represent greed and corruption in his public image. So brave and audacious, have been eclipsed by the challenges in both personal and professional life in his older years. he has encountered when Don King arrived at his late. The man who once dominated boxing in the 1980s saw his empire with an iron grip disintegrate. His legacy, which formerly included of battles and warriors that set records, Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson, were currently tainted by a mix of financial shortcomings, difficulties in life, and a lack of confidence from the sportsman he once referred to as his business associates. Financial circumstances worsened significantly as his capacity to produce the money made from fighting decreased after the sponsor of some of the most lucrative sports history occurrences that King has now discovered himself encouraging smaller, less successful fights, and his well-known matchups were scarce, and those that he did not always succeed in securing fulfilled his financial obligations. Empire that was once worth millions of dollars operation was whittled down to what he once had to confront the truth of his diminishing impact as the new, more transparent the sport was taken over by promoters. And King had difficulty adjusting to the shifting the financial issues facing landscape. King were made worse by growing debt. Litigation and outstanding debts accumulated, and the lavish way of life he had led appeared far away for decades. Recall his once dominant home in that he had lived like a king in the Bahamas was empty now, and his possessions were being captured to conceal his many obligations. He was a man confined by his king has long been notorious for his own excesses, for his flamboyant fashion sense, but now those overt manifestations of affluence were just serves as a reminder of the sharp drop in his wealth, the cash that had previously drained so effortlessly, and the era of luxury in interviews was over. He looked worn out, a far cry from the loud, brazen individual who once held the boxing community's interest. In his audience, appearances decreased in frequency, and were frequently characterized by aging indicators, and those who formerly admired him are now weak. Perceived him as a fallen person who was no longer the he used to be, a powerhouse. Now he's a guy attempting to preserve a dwindling tradition. Don King was gone, even in his later years. Kept fighting outside of the ring, but to stay relevant in a world that had gone by him without his name. Formerly associated with boxing's largest things become less identifiable to younger sports fans. The fighter generation did not have much to do with him, and his impact on the game started to wane. Bob Arum and other promoters, as well as Dana White, who ran more contemporary and King's, was overshadowed by organized businesses. Legacy. But King had previously changed the way that boxing was marketed. The sector had advanced to King is still being left behind by new models. King's pride, which had consistently been his success's primary motivator, declined to allow him to silently disappear into the background. He still desired attention. It was still necessary to appear this desperate. Due to his need for attention, he made attendance at boxing matches, although they were merely sentimental now. Journeys for admirers who recalled his splendor. He would attend interviews on certain days, frequently making absurd claims regarding his ongoing participation in boxing, but he was not being taken seriously by anyone. King's desperation was no longer concealed. At such times, a guy is grabbing at importance, unable to relinquish the empire he had constructed despite mounting. Don King's personal and financial struggles also experienced health issues as his body grew older. The man who had previously associated with vitality and vigor started to reduce. King's health issues weren't limited to bodily ones. They were made worse by the mental burden of his numerous years of residing in the draw attention to the strain of his legal and financial struggles started to have an impact, as his formerly rapid intellect slowed. Certainly not as acute as the one that had once demonstrated his capacity to create fast-making audacious choices in boxing now appeared to a dim recollection of his character, which had formerly been vivacious and dominant. Felt exhausted like a king who had renown for his loud voice, presently found it difficult to keep up the same amount of energy that he physical attributes also revealed indications of aging, the flamboyant attire and unruly hair. that were once his defining characteristics were regarded as relics from a past time when King appeared in public. He was frequently met with a blend of curiosity and sympathy. Once adoring fans now viewed him uncertain about what to make from a distance of the globe that was promoted by the fallen had formerly revered him was now full of amid doubt and mistrust. King's connections with his family, especially his kids, also turned into Carl and Corrido, his two boys, were under stress. Had been cut off from their Carl, whose father lived in a chaotic world, worked in boxing at different times and had separated from the king's empire. Recognizing that the heritage of his father was one of deceit and Corrido, King's other son, was exploited much more severe problems with his dad having attempted for years to get away from the shadow cast by the father on both of his sons. The broader public perception of Don King compared to life, the man who had the seemingly limitless power, was eclipsed by the personal reality of a broken family separated by manipulation of ambition and a persistent desire for confirmation of Don King, the individual who had possessed a vast army of combatants, could unable to maintain his family's unity. His private life reflected the breakdown of his professional life, a man whose grand delusions of influence and power disintegrated as the years passed, and his need to stay in the public eye and be perceived as the boxing king had guided him to disregard the more crucial elements of life. Like many of those close to him, his sons, he had long since come to the realization that they were dealing with a shell of a guy. Seeing his prior personality as a holdover from a bygone age, King was compelled to, as he approached his 90s, acknowledge that his rule over once a powerhouse, boxing, had long since ended. Don King now found himself in the sport a lost person, consigned to on the fringes of the sport. He'd previously, despite being constrained, his name still had weight. However, it was now connected to a record of the uproar and outrage surrounding his exploitation. His health had declined, and he was alone because of his financial difficulties. With few individuals prepared to stand with him, the name King was no longer connected with the sport's glitz, but with its darker side as the crooked side. Cases pertaining to contracts and unfulfilled commitments. Without him, boxing had progressed, and most people have forgotten the man who had once been in the middle of everything. This insight was an unpleasant one for King, one with which he had always identified boxing, and as the game developed, he was abandoned after his frantic efforts to remain current. Whether by public appearances or continuing to advertise, there were more and more minor altercations. As depressing attempts to recover the honor the days that have gone by since the downfall of Don King is a sobering reminder of the transient character of celebrity and of the price of his desire. He had constructed his empire on aggressive manipulation strategies for negotiating and the capacity to create spectacle. But those same techniques that had brought him wealth and authority also resulted in his king's decline. As he grew older, was compelled to deal with the fallout from a lifetime of seeking approval and holding on to his past health, legacy, and relationships all suffered as a consequence. But even in his last years, Don King continued to be motivated by the necessity of focus, the necessity of the spotlight, and conviction that he could never really disappear. But the boxing community had a lengthy went on, abandoning Don King with merely the remnants of his history, a fading legend in a long-standing sport. By the time Don King outgrew him, he was in his 90s and no longer he used to be a strong figure in boxing, been the individual in charge of the Iron Fist sport, transforming it into an entertainment empire and a spectacle. Suddenly had to confront the harsh truth of being forgotten. The name that was originally associated with the greatest battles in history had become interconnected to a more dubious and contentious legacy. His condition was deteriorating, and his financial difficulties had left him with little funds to sustain the extravagant way of life he once led. Like Don King, who was formerly revered and dreaded by combatants and both promoters, and he now discovered secluded and mostly unimportant in the sport, has long since carried on without him. King's public life in his last years, there were very few appearances. has turned into a remnant frequently observed in the background of boxing matches in an effort to continue to be relevant in a world where got past his antiquated method of advertising the ostentatious entrances, the vibrant language, and lofty promises. They had all lost their influence. King attempted to leave his mark by collaborating with younger combatants, yet the King's influence was diminished. King has turned into a figurehead in boxing. A man who was no longer able to produce the appearance that had previously made him a well-known figure's efforts to remain were frequently viewed with suspicion. As well as his increasingly unpredictable actions only strengthened the idea that he was holding on to a past that has vanished. The last years of Don King's life were characterized by a profound feeling of isolation, and regretting how much of his life he had spent pursuing his wealth and notoriety, disregarded his personal relationships, and currently in his later years, he was left without the assistance of those who had previously been closest to him, his connections with his boys in particular, who had years of tension, and they had